Welcome. Today, I will cover 3 different true crime cases. All the cases I cover on this channel are real and well documented on the media. But before we start, please comment down below where you are right now and what time it is. Thanks. Let's get to it. In 1998, a letter surfaced in a dusty New Orleans archive, its ink browned, its paper thin as onion skin. The handwriting slanted and angry, signed only with a chilling name, the Axeman. For decades, the letter had been whispered about, copied, embellished, a relic from one of the strangest killing sprees in American history. Between 1918 and 1919, the Crescent City didn't sleep. Someone stalked the narrow streets with an axe, slipping through back doors, choosing his victims with uncanny precision. He didn't steal, he didn't run, he killed, then vanished into the music. And when fear reached its peak, he sent that letter, promising to spare any home playing jazz at midnight. People obeyed. Whole blocks erupted in sound that night. The city became one frantic orchestra, playing for its life. This is the story of New Orleans' most mysterious killer, the man who turned murder into music, the Axeman. It began before dawn on May 23, 1918, in a small apartment behind a corner grocery on Upper Line Street. Joseph and Catherine Maggio slept in their bed after a family gathering. The back door's wood panel had been carefully chiseled out. No broken lock, no shattered glass. The intruder didn't bring a weapon. He found a heavy axe in the house. In the cramped bedroom, one swing, then another. The blade didn't wake the neighbors. The groans did. Next door, relatives heard strange sounds, soft and rhythmic, like someone struggling to breathe. When they pushed inside, they found Joseph and Catherine mutilated, the sheets soaked. On the kitchen table, a straight razor lay open, its edge stained. In the backyard, the axe leaned against a wall. Money sat untouched in a drawer. Jewelry was still on the nightstand. Police called it robbery at first, then backed away from that fast. Nothing of value was missing, except the feeling of safety. Get this, the grocery was Italian-owned, like so many corner stores across New Orleans then. Families lived behind the shop or upstairs, sleeping feet from their livelihood. That proximity made them targets without knowing it. The press jumped on the Italian angle. Headlines hinted at organized crime. Some neighbors whispered about old country feuds. But the scene didn't look like a hit. It looked deliberate and quiet, with an abnormal calm in the method. Panel removed, house tool weapon, exit the way he came. The razor became its own mystery. A local barber recognized it as one he had sharpened, traced back to a relative connected to Joseph. It muddied the water, fueled talk that maybe this wasn't a stranger's work. Police detained family members, chased the razor's path, and got nowhere. Meanwhile, the city's immigrant districts watched their doors and listened at night for that soft scrape of wood against wood. Then June turned to July, and the next scene unfolded. Early morning, a different address, same basic setup. This time the victims were Louis Bissouma, the grocer, and his partner, Anna Harriet Lowe, in the quarters behind their shop. Again, a panelled section of the back door had been neatly removed. Again, the attacker used an axe taken from the premises. Bissouma survived the initial assault with head injuries, confused and stunned, while Anna, badly hurt, fought for weeks before dying of her wounds later that summer. Her final statements pulled investigators in multiple directions, and the public leaned in with them, while officers drifted between theories: burglary gone wrong, lovers' quarrel, itinerant laborer. The pattern grew clearer. The attacks favored night or early pre-dawn hours. The victims often had ties to small groceries. The killer avoided bringing a weapon, preferring whatever heavy blade the home offered. The force suggested someone strong, practiced, or both. And just like before, valuables were spared. If he wanted money, it was there. He didn't take it. Newspapers had a field day. They gave the fear a name and a face that didn't exist. They printed maps, lines, speculations. Some reporters called it a random maniac. Others said the grocer angle meant something darker. In living rooms, people slid dressers in front of doors and nailed windows shut. A mother on Prytania Street told her children to sleep in the front room, closer to the streetlights, as if light could hold back a blade. A hardware store owner said he sold out of heavy bolts twice in a week. In August 1918, the violence landed on another Italian grocer, Joseph Romano. His nieces woke to a heavy thud and rushed to his room. They saw a figure retreating through the back, a shape they described as tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes and a slouched hat. Romano staggered, bleeding heavily, and died shortly after. Again, the axe came from his own home. Again, cash and goods remained untouched. And again, the entry point was that precise removal of a door panel, as if the house itself had given permission. Police tried to show strength, more patrols in affected neighborhoods, questioning drifters, raiding rooms above corner bars. Arrests came and went, thin cases that didn't stick. The city's rumor mill ran faster than any squad car. People watched their grocers' steps. Clergy preached caution without naming the terror. In the papers, new theories sprang up. Maybe there were two attackers, maybe a copycat, maybe a feud masked as madness. What nobody knew at the time was how the method itself, quiet entry, silent tools, a weapon left behind, would become the only signature investigators could trust. Not a calling card, not a symbol, just absence. And while fear spread, the method got bolder. The next move would push past private dread and into public spectacle, where the killer's voice, real or forged, would be heard above the music. While detectives argued over motives, the patterns stopped whispering and started speaking plainly. The men and women attacked were often small grocers or lived next to them. The killer came after midnight, preferred a back entrance, and avoided breaking anything he didn't have to. A chiseled panel was cleaner, quieter. He moved through sleeping rooms like he knew the layout. If a house had an axe, he used it. If a house had cash on hand, he left it. That restraint rattled people more than theft ever could. August bled into autumn, and the name that stuck in memory was Joseph Romano. After the attack, his nieces told police about the figure they saw, tall, a hat low over his face, moving fast but not panicked. They noticed how he held his shoulders, like he was carrying weight, or had carried it for a long time. That detail sent patrolmen looking for laborers with backs like dock workers. It sent everyone else to their back doors with hammers and extra nails. Grocers formed little circles after closing time. They shared coffee, compared door hardware, swapped gossip about strangers who lingered too long by the flour sacks. Some took to sleeping with a shotgun across their laps. Others moved their families to relatives' homes in different wards. A few hired cousins to stand watch until dawn, paid in bread and small bills. The sound of a chisel against wood became the city's most feared noise, a sound you might not hear until it was too late. Police chiefs promised results. They sent squads into boarding houses, rousted men who drifted in and out of day labor, and filled jails with suspects who matched no one's description beyond male, strong. The arrests felt efficient on paper and empty in real kitchens. Judges complained about the weak cases. Reporters trailed officers on raids and filed breathless copy that sold papers and tightened nerves. Editorials urged calm. Headlines did the opposite. Hardware stores couldn't keep up. Owners packed their counters with new locks, hasps, iron braces, and heavy bars. One clerk said people were buying padlocks for interior doors, turning bedrooms into small vaults. Carpenters did brisk business installing crossbars. Families hammered coffee cans filled with nails onto windowsills. A desperate, improvised alarm. A child told her teacher she could finally sleep because her father put flour on the kitchen floor. He'd see footprints if a man came. That night, a cat ruined the plan, and the family didn't sleep at all. False alarms flooded precincts. A dog barked in Algiers and 3 houses lit up at once. A loose shutter in the Bywater sent a widow to her neighbor's porch with a pistol wrapped in a dish towel. Officers ran from call to call, sawed door edges, dangling panels, and sometimes just fear given a shape. They couldn't be everywhere, and everyone knew it. The press rivalry added fuel. One paper printed a map with pins for each attack, and arrows to suggest the killer's route, like a storm forecast. Another paper ran a column claiming there had to be more than one man. No single attacker could move so freely, they argued. A letter to the editor insisted the culprit was a jilted lover and the grocer angle was a smokescreen. People took sides as if picking a suspect could make the night shorter. Meanwhile, patrolmen watched for patterns inside the pattern. Entry was almost always a back door with a panel removed near the lock, low enough to reach through and unbolt from the inside. The cuts looked practiced. Clean edges, efficient size. Tools? Likely a common chisel, maybe a screwdriver ground to a wedge. Door frames told the same story again and again. What nobody knew at the time, standing in kitchens with lamps turned low, was that the pattern had one more layer to reveal, and it wouldn't come from a crime scene. It would come from a voice on paper. The city thought it understood the rules: grocers, back doors, midnight, household acts, no theft. Those rules held until a note arrived that set new terms. Then the fear didn't just sit behind doors, it took over the streets, and every room with a gramophone became a sanctuary. 6 months after the first attacks, a different kind of blow landed, not on a door, but on a newsroom desk. Dated March 13th, 1919, the letter arrived, addressed to the papers, written in a voice that sounded like a dare. The writer claimed to be from a place no policeman could reach, all bravado and heat. He mocked the city, mocked the cops, and then set a condition that turned private fear into a public countdown. On the night of March 19th, anyone playing jazz would be safe. Anyone who wasn't, he said he'd visit. The phrasing stuck to the city like humidity. He boasted about being beyond men's grasp, taunted that he was worse than any mortal criminal. Then the pivot. He professed a love of music, especially jazz, and promised to spare every home where it could be heard at midnight. It was theatre on paper, a threat wrapped in style. Whether he was the real attacker or a copycat with a flair for the dramatic, the effect was the same. The city had a deadline and a strange rule to follow. The week between the letter and the date felt unreal. Bands got booked like it was Mardi Gras on command. Dance halls sold out, not for celebration but for cover. Saloons dragged pianos to their doors. Families without phonographs borrowed them or gathered around a neighbor's Victrola. Priests received questions they'd never expected to hear. Is God okay with hiring a cornet player to keep my family alive? Police leadership, caught off guard, doubled patrols. But patrols couldn't sit in every parlor. They couldn't guarantee that a gramophone needle wouldn't snap at the wrong moment. Strategy meetings went late. Officers argued over whether the letter was a prank. They didn't have time to decide. The fear had already made the city move. That Wednesday night, the sound rose like a low tide and kept rising. Streetcars rattled past, open windows spilling brass. In neighborhoods where the attacks had hit hardest, the music was relentless. Hired trios played on stoops for a handful of coins and coffee. A baker set his Victrola in the doorway and cranked it until the spring whined. A teenager in Tremé used a clarinet he'd only half learned to keep a rhythm going while his father watched the alley with a lantern. A strange thing happened inside that fear. People crossed thresholds they'd never crossed. A German family walked into an Italian grocer's living room because he had a piano and welcomed them in. A widow hosted a quartet, paid for by 3 houses on her block. She served chicory coffee like it was a ritual. Musicians carried the pressure with steady hands. They weren't just playing to entertain, they were, in many minds, holding death at the curb. Midnight came and went with the city still loud. Patrolmen heard the hours strike from church towers through layers of syncopation. The promised slaughter didn't arrive. No new murders that night. Instead, exhaustion, relief, and the aftertaste of something that felt like defiance and submission at the same time. They'd followed the letter's rules. Nothing happened. Did that mean the letter was genuine, or did the noise simply smother a bluff? In the days after, arguments lit up the papers. One columnist called the whole thing a hoax, engineered by a prankster, with a dictionary and a mean streak. Another insisted the letter matched the killer's rhythm, if not his hand, then his mind. Police said they couldn't authenticate the writer. Some officers privately admitted they were glad for any night without blood, but the quiet didn't last. The entry panels would be cut again. The axe would come off another wall. The music faded with the sunrise, and life lurched back to normal, if normal meant sleeping in shifts and looking twice at every shadow. Whether the letter was real or not, it proved one thing. The terror had learned how to speak, and the city had shown it would listen. Summer pressed in heavy and close. The letter's echo hadn't faded when August 1919 tore the city awake again. Late one night, a grocer named Steve Bocker staggered from his bed, head split, face wet with blood, trying to make sense of a room that spun and blurred. He'd been struck while sleeping. The back door told the same soft story. Panel cut, latch unhooked, no splinters on the floor. Bocker lurched into the street and collapsed on a neighbor's step. When he could speak, he wasn't sure if he'd seen anything at all. Memory frayed. He described a dark figure, maybe tall, maybe not, maybe wearing a hat. Doubt clung to every detail because survival had cost him clarity. Doctors tended to him while officers traced footprints that broke apart in hard-packed dirt. Bocker's confusion became its own kind of headline. If a man who lived it couldn't say what he saw, what could anyone else trust? People wanted certainties. Instead, they got fragments, and the quiet scrape of newsprint over new fear. Neighbors sat up that night, with lamps turned low, the light angled toward door frames like they could catch the next intruder in the beam. 2 weeks later, the pattern slid from back doors to a window. In September, a young woman named Sarah Lauman didn't wake when her assailant entered. She woke to pain. A window sash showed pry marks. Her room showed chaos and a smear of blood on the pillow. She survived, dazed, struggling to remember the shape that passed through her room like a shadow with weight. Some said it meant the attacker was improvising, carrying fewer tools to avoid notice. Others thought it proved there were multiple men. Whoever hit Bocca wasn't the same person who climbed through a sash. Police said they were keeping an open mind. The city had no such luxury. These weren't distant crimes you could rationalize away. They were knives to the map, cutting across neighborhoods that shared little beyond their fear. Street talk turned practical. Where to sleep, how to brace a window, who would take first watch. Men traded shifts like dock work, 2 hours on, 2 off, coffee at dawn, when eyelids twitched from nerves. Clergy started meeting with parish committees to organize block watches. One group created a decoy routine, leave a lamp burning, prop pillows under a sheet, then sit in the dark kitchen with a shotgun and the door in sight. It worked for morale more than anything else. October arrived with a blow no one could frame as a narrow escape. Mike Pepitone, another grocer, was found in his home on a violent, chaotic scene. His family's cries brought neighbors running. The room looked like a storm had hit it. Blood spatter, crushed plaster, a toppled chair. A figure fled into the darkness. The people who rushed in saw aftermath more than evidence. Pepitone died. The household axe was there. Cash wasn't touched. The entry, again a quiet defeat of a back barrier, the house helping the intruder without meaning to. Witness accounts multiplied and cancelled each other. A tall man in dark clothes, a medium build with a stiff gait, a slouched hat, a bare head. Officers filled notebooks that contradicted themselves within pages. A detective muttered that the killer was either a chameleon or they were chasing noise. Patrol commanders announced more raids and more checkpoints. Lists of suspects ballooned, then deflated when alibis held or handwriting didn't match the letter. A few arrests stuck long enough to calm one block for a week, then fell apart under scrutiny. Theories surged and crashed in the public square. One camp, named the Mafia, pointing to the grocer link and old extortion whispers. Another camp said no. This felt too erratic for organized crime, too theatrical, more like a traveling laborer with head injuries and a taste for making headlines. A minority clung to the idea of jealous lovers and tangled domestic grudges, insisting each attack had its own cause tied to the victim's life. The trouble was, motive never stayed put. The method did. Meanwhile, hardware counters still emptied by noon. Tin cans rattled on strings over back doors. Families moved beds away from windows and stacked flour bags against sills to catch prints that, in practice, blurred into smudges. A boy swore he saw a hand reach through the panel of his aunt's door. It was a curtain shifting with the breeze. A patrolman tripped over a tripwire of twine and coffee cups in a kitchen and laughed until he realized he'd startled a child into tears. Everyone was trying to turn their home into a fortress with string and prayer. Investigators needed a face to anchor the dread. They pushed informants, leaned on known troublemakers, and chased rumors of a man who asked too many questions about store closing times. Each lead dissolved into ordinary life. A sailor on shore leave, a mason between jobs, a cousin sleeping in a storeroom. The nights stretched. The city adjusted its heartbeat to match a schedule set by a man no one could name. And under it all, one truth kept resurfacing. The attacks were not stopping, and the margin between a survivor's confusion and a family's grief was a pane of wood and a few silent minutes. Investigators needed someone to point to, so they started close and messy. The first easy suspect was a victim himself, Louis Bissouma. He had lived through the attack that killed Anna Harriet Lowe, and rumors clung to him. Police found letters in foreign languages in his rooms and decided mystery meant guilt. He was arrested, released, arrested again on fragile theories, then dragged through court over technical charges. None of it tied him to the late-night entries or the axes that came from victims' kitchens. The case against him was noise that comforted no one. Another early target was anyone who could be threaded into the razor found at the Maggio home. Relatives were questioned. A barber's sharpening notes became exhibits, but the razor never explained the chiseled panel, the quiet exits, or the habit of leaving money behind. It only showed how a single object could widen suspicion until it swallowed families whole. While detectives chased edges, The pattern continued without caring who sat in holding cells that week. Then a name drifted into the story like smoke. Mumfre, sometimes printed as Montfray, sometimes White. He was rumoured to have ties to extortion rackets that targeted Italian groceries. Extortion and grocers fit the fear people already had, so the rumour found a home. The legend went further. Years later, in Los Angeles, a woman named Esther Albano, also recorded as Pepitone's widow in some accounts, shot a man named Joseph Mumfre, claiming he had ruined her life and hinting at a tie to the New Orleans killings. It sounded like a neat ending. A suspected extortionist dead in another city, a widow's trigger answering a city's prayer. But the paper trail buckled under scrutiny. Records on Mumfre were inconsistent. Some timelines did not line up with the attacks. Court documents that should have been clear were missing or pointed to other crimes, not midnight assaults with household axes. Historians digging decades later found more contradictions than confirmations. If there was a man like that leaning on small shops, the evidence tying him to the door panels and the wielded blades never settled into something firm. The White theory promised closure. It delivered a story with soft edges and gaps. Other suspects came from closer to home. Lovers with grudges, disgruntled employees who knew where families slept, itinerant workers who had drifted through the neighborhood at the wrong hour, patrolmen scooped up men with scars, men with hammers in their satchels, men whose alibis relied on friends who were not keen to talk. A few confessions surfaced, thin things that crumbled when timelines were checked, or when a suspect could not describe the cut of a panel that had soaked the city's front pages. Meanwhile, the tools of certainty were limited. No centralized fingerprint databases, photographs matched by eye, handwriting analysis that leaned more on confidence than science. Press reports bent facts to fit narratives, and those narratives circled back into police theory. A detective read a column about a supposed chisel design and started asking witnesses about it, which made witnesses remember the thing they were asked to remember. Feedback loops grew like vines. Why did it stall? Because motive kept slipping away. Robbery did not fit. Revenge did not fit every house. Organized crime did not fit the theatrical letter. A drifter's madness explained the randomness but not the repeated focus on grocers. The killer used what was at hand, which left no purchase for investigators, no gun to trace, no unique blade, no vehicle sightings that repeated. Neighborhoods changed from block to block, and fear made each street corner its own theory factory. By the time the files thinned, one possibility remained in the background. Maybe there was not one face. Maybe there were a few men with similar habits, or a single attacker who learned, paused, and moved on. The city wanted a name to carry, something to blame at night. Instead, it got fog suspects who faded when the light hit them, and a case that resisted the relief of a final period. When the entries stopped, the stories did not. That March night turned into family lore. Grandparents told children about the evening the city made music to keep a blade away. Decades later, people still argued over who played what and which block had the loudest horn. Bars kept the tale alive between sets. A few musicians worked the letter into patter before a tune, half joke, half memorial, to a night when jazz sounded like insurance. Songs followed. A local composer wrote a piece about the killer's promise, turning a threat into a melody people could hum. Theatre troupes adapted the letter for the stage, giving the author a swagger the case files never proved. Novels folded the Axeman into plots, and radio shows leaned on the same details: backdoors, household axes, and the citywide concert, because those were the parts that stuck in memory. The killer's voice, real or not, became part of the genre vocabulary, a reference point for how fear can be loud. New Orleans has always carried its history in sound: brass bands for funerals, rhythm in the streets, music as public memory. The Axemen slipped into that rhythm. Immigrant neighborhoods that once watched door panels now watched their stories get retold by people who had never seen those streets in 1919. The grocers' blocks became settings for more than commerce. They were backdrops for a myth about a city that negotiated with terror by playing pianos until midnight. Meanwhile, true crime books and documentaries sifted the records with new tools. Some tried to tie the Axeman to a larger pattern of axe attacks across the South, like the earlier servant girl annihilator cases in Texas. The comparison felt tidy. Similar weapons, nighttime entries, households turned upside down. But historians warned about conflation. Shared methods did not mean shared hands. Axes were common. Backdoors were common. Cities in fear repeat each other's defenses and mistakes. The letter's authenticity kept sparking debate. Was it the attacker? A prankster? A journalist testing circulation? Handwriting analysis never settled it, and the tone fiery, theatrical, felt designed to be remembered. That was the point. The promise of safety through sound lodged itself deeper than any suspect list. Ask people what they recall, and they mention the jazz before they recall names like Maggio, Basuma, or Pepitone. The victims became chapters. The letter became a chorus. Theories aged and hardened. The Mumfrey story survived because it resolved anxiety. A villain shot in another city. Case closed by chance. But the records stayed messy. Other suspects drifted in and out of podcasts and late-night arguments. Some locals still say there were multiple attackers who learned from headlines. Others hold to the lone figure under a slouched hat. The police files did not choose for them. That left room for folklore to do what it always does. Fill silence with a shape that feels right. If you listen closely, you can hear how the city processed the months when back doors felt like invitations. People turned fear into routine, then memory, then legend. A killer threatened New Orleans with a condition. The city answered with a soundtrack. Even now, the story gets hauled out when the first horn line lands on a warm night. It is a reminder of who was lost, and how the living found a way to stay up until the danger passed, one chorus at a time. A murderer set rules. A city chose music, turning raw fear into something people could hold together for a night. If you want the rare clippings, disputed timelines, and deeper suspect files, stick around for our extended breakdown next, and subscribe for more carefully built true stories that follow the evidence into the dark. Let's get to story number 2. The sax cut off mid-phrase, and the club lights lifted just enough to show the red on the floor. At the back table, a man in a linen suit didn't flinch. He folded a napkin, set it down, and said one sentence that would push the city past its breaking point. By morning, radio hosts were whispering about a deadline that could not be missed. Pay, confess, or more bodies. The band packed up in silence while police chalked marks that smudged under shoe soles. Out on the sidewalk, someone hummed the melody the sax never finished, steady, like a warning. It started 2 nights earlier, in a rain that fell straight down. A bartender was counting the draw when the front door opened to the kind of silence that arrives before trouble. The man who came in didn't order. He placed a matchbook on the counter, the club's logo burned into it, and asked what time the last set usually wrapped. The bartender said 11. The man nodded, turned, and left with the matchbook still there, like an appointment card nobody wanted. By 11:15, a trumpet case lay open next to a bent stand. People said the shooter stood near the service exit, close enough to hear the drummers count. 3 shots, tight, professional. The target was a promoter who had been squeezing musicians, a man who believed contracts and favors were the same thing. The crowd dropped, then froze, waiting on the next sound. The door banged, and the shooter vanished into the rain that kept falling like nothing had happened. It felt like a message, but nobody knew how to read it yet. The second strike came fast. The next evening, in a narrow hallway that smelled like bleach and perfume, a club owner, the kind who wore rings too heavy for his fingers, walked out of his office and didn't make it to the end of the corridor. 2 rounds into the paneling behind him, one into the exit sign that flickered afterward like it was trying to choose a side. A waitress saw a figure in a flat cap, remembered the way he didn't rush, and told detectives she thought he hummed on his way down the stairs. Police spread out across the block, taking names before stories hardened. They wrote flat cap twice, then scrubbed it out when another witness said no, it was a knit beanie. The surveillance system had been installed but not connected. Records showed the owner had signed the invoice and never paid. An officer laughed once, then stopped. They canvassed doorways and stoops until the street emptied to the sound of bottles clinking into bins. What nobody knew at the time was that a sheet of paper taped under the promoter's desk held a list. Club names, debt amounts, and initials. The first 2 lines matched the dead. A third read, "After Friday, no second chances." The promoter's assistant admitted he wrote it for his boss, a reminder to call in money owed or cut acts that weren't pulling crowds. It looked like ordinary greed until you noticed the dates. Every deadline fell on a weekend night when the room would be full and the lights turned down. It was a schedule for humiliation, and someone flipped it. While that was happening near Midtown, a trumpet player packed his horn and drove straight to his sister's apartment. He had been warned to clear out for a week. The warning came from a man everyone called Cousin, though he wasn't related to anybody in any legal sense. Cousin said the streets were going to settle a score, and the first notes had already been played. He told the trumpet player to tell no one, which the trumpet player followed until he sat on a milk crate in his sister's kitchen and told her everything. She called a friend who used to date a detective. By morning, the story had already traveled farther than the shooter. Meanwhile, something else was happening across town. A small jazz magazine received a letter with clipped words and a tone that tried too hard to sound calm. "We will restore balance," it read. "If you take without giving, you will be attended to." It wasn't the language of a stick-up. It sounded like a committee, or one man pretending to be many. The editor turned the letter over to police, who sent it to the lab for prints. The paper came from a common notepad, the glue line jagged. No prints, just a faint smear of oil that matched half the city. This was the moment everything changed for the venues. Owners met behind locked doors to compare notes. Some admitted to taking bigger cuts than agreed. Some claimed innocence and glared at the rest. A manager said, under his breath, that maybe the dead had it coming. His sound tech quit that afternoon, saying he didn't want to check mics for targets. By nightfall, clubs posted private security at side doors, which made patrons feel safe and performers feel exposed. The police chief faced cameras and chose his words like he was diffusing wires. He called the killings targeted, said the department had promising leads, then asked for patience he knew the city didn't have. He didn't mention the list. He didn't mention the letter. He didn't talk about the ultimatum some were already whispering about, the one rumored to land at midnight on Saturday, printed on black paper with white letters. He needed quiet. The city needed noise to cover its fear. In the neighborhoods, bartenders kept towels within reach and left the front lights brighter than usual. Musicians stayed close to back walls and watched doorways between sets. Deals that would have stretched over months were settled in a single handshake, cash in envelopes, no talk of percentages. The rain slowed to a mist, then stopped. The streets held the wet like they were waiting for the next set to start, and for someone to decide when the downbeat would land. The ultimatum settled over Saturday like fog, thin at first, then everywhere. By noon, club owners were making quiet calls to grocers with back rooms. They asked for cash change, for the kind of envelopes that slide across counters without talk. A grocer on Jefferson opened his register, counted out stacks, and asked who they were paying. The manager said, "Insurance," and left with his pockets heavy and his eyes on the door. He told the band they would take a short break every 30 minutes. He didn't say why. Everyone knew. Back doors turned into main doors. Performers parked in alleys, slipped in through kitchens, and tuned near mop sinks. A bass player set his instrument down beside crates of grapefruit and practiced in a whisper, fingers walking in air. A dishwasher leaned in and asked if the rumors were true. The bass player said, "Rumors always have an author." He checked his phone, which buzzed with a message from a friend at another club. "Cash on the table," it read. "No receipts. Midnight is real." At a place on Monroe, the owner posted a security guard at the restroom corridor and changed the lighting to something flatter, less theatrical. He wanted sightlines. He told the band to keep tempos up, to avoid ballads that slowed the room. It was superstition mixed with strategy. A faster room might make a shooter hesitate. A slower room might make everyone hear the click that comes before the damage. He stayed near the soundboard, a hand always on the master fader, as if volume could solve what bullets start. Meanwhile, police ran a quiet sweep through loading bays. Officers checked door chains, looked for fresh scuffs on fire exits, and asked bartenders to text if they saw the flat cap, or the beanie, or whatever headwear the story had settled on for the night. They stationed cars on cross streets with engines off and windows down. They had a list of venues rumoured to be on the unknown list nobody had seen, and they passed those addresses between units like a prayer. The magazine editor who received the first letter got another one folded inside a copy of their latest issue. Same clipped tone, same attempt at ceremony. "Midnight marks," it read. "Names who took will return what they took, or we will balance the page." It named no one. It did not need to. Bands took cash in green rooms and split it on the spot, hands moving like dealers at a table. No talk of later. Later had become a word nobody trusted. Grocers became bankers. A popular corner market rolled up its steel gate at 10, then locked the front and opened the back to a line of managers carrying deposit bags. The owner's son counted with his thumb, the way his grandfather did when the city was younger and less polished. He remembered stories about protection that sounded like this one, dressed different, meaning the same. He asked if police knew. The managers shrugged. Police knew everything and nothing. That is what nights like this teach you. Midnight got closer. Clubs dimmed, lights a little less. Some left them bright and called it a theme. A drummer took off his rings, put them in his shoe, and played with bare hands for a sound that cut cleaner and didn't flash. A singer asked for a mic check 3 times. She hated how her voice sounded like it was waiting to be interrupted. She pressed her lips together between verses and looked at the side door. At 11:50, a text ran the length of the district. Webster hit. It was wrong by a block and right by a mile. A small room 2 streets over heard the snap of something hard against metal in the alley. The barback peeked and saw a fuel can turned sideways, wick cut short, flame already eating the rim. He grabbed the salt bin, dumped it, drew a circle, and stomped until the glow turned grey. He laughed once, out of shock, then called the owner. They decided it wasn't a message, it was practice. That felt worse. Then midnight came and passed like a train you expected to stop and didn't. For a minute, nothing happened. Heads lifted, shoulders dropped a hair. A sax started a solo that threaded through the room and made people remember they came for music, not menace. A bouncer near the kitchen door smiled at a cook and mouthed, "We're good." The cook nodded and went back to plating fries with hands that calmed. 2 minutes later, a single shot cracked from a hallway behind the stage at a club on Alexander. Not the main room, not the crowd, the backstage where knees bend and nerves settle before the up-tempo tune. The bullet took a strip of drywall and buried in a beam. Nobody fell. The point landed anyway. A second shot punched a mirror in a green room where a manager had been counting. Glass hit the floor like hail. He scooped bills into a duffel with fingers that wouldn't listen. Across the street, a grocer flipped his sign to closed and stood inside the door with his keys. He watched a shadow move across the club's upstairs windows like a cloud crossing a lamp. His phone chimed. Another message. Brighton next. He locked his register, walked to the back, and checked the alley twice. He had learned, fast, that back doors are not exits, they are invitations. He wedged a crate under the knob from inside and told his nephew to sleep in the office. Police arrived fast enough to catch people still crouched. They moved through in pairs, hands open, voices low. They found the broken mirror and the beam with a fresh wound. No brass, no prints, a hint of oil on the door push that matched the smear from the letter because everyone touches doors. The chief got the call and felt the city glow with the heat of almost mass harm, almost peace, almost a break that would name a face. The pattern had hardened. Midnight was a time, a stage mark, a promise that future nights would keep. Sunday morning arrived with a quiet that felt like a bruise. The magazine editor unlocked his office, stepped over a stack of back issues, and saw an envelope propped against his door. White, unmarked, a thin strip of tape across the flap. He stood there a full minute before he bent to pick it up. He thought about calling the detective first. He thought about coffee. He slit the edge with a plastic ruler he had used for years to crop photos and slid out a single page. Jazz in every home. That was the header. Centered, printed in thick black, letters cut clean as if from a template. Under it, paragraphs arranged like a manifesto. Short lines and pauses where sentences could have run. The voice was the same, clipped calm, but the mood had changed. It sounded less like punishment and more like a plan. If you profit, you share. If you take, you repay. If you listen, you will not bleed. He read the lines twice, then picked up the phone. Detectives took the page by the corners and laid it flat. A tech scanned it, then bagged it, and swapped in a high-resolution copy for reading. The first paragraph set the terms. 10% from door and bar, counted nightly, placed in envelopes marked with the date, given to performers before the last set. The second offered what it called compliance support. It listed drop points, back rooms at 3 markets, and a pawn shop, where envelopes could be confirmed for fairness if trust ran thin. The third section promised community audits, a phrase that made the chief write it down twice, underline it, and draw a box he hoped would stop it from getting bigger in his head. The kicker sat at the end. 3 strikes are over, warnings are done, the next imbalance draws blood where you hide it. That line read colder than the header. It sounded like someone who thinks he is reasonable until he is not. It named no clubs. It did not tie to specific nights. It turned a city into a test of interpretation, which is a hard way to breathe. While that was happening in the bullpen, the editor explained how the envelope had been set at his door. The building's camera covered the stairwell, not the hallway. The copier downstairs had toner on the floor from a spill on Friday. The shoe prints that crossed it were a blur of softened edges. A detective asked about the phrase, jazz in every home. The editor said it sounded like a slogan from the 1950s, the kind of optimistic line you see in magazine ads showing record players and perfect dinners. He said it might be a joke, bitter and pointed, or it might be a wish, twisted into a rule. Club owners read a copy by late afternoon. Some laughed at the math, not because it was wrong, but because it was simple. 10% would not break them. 10%, made a rule by a gun, would break them in a different way. A manager called his bartender and asked if the cash box could handle a new split every set. She said yes, if he stood there and watched her count, because trust was fragile now, and arithmetic gets strange when fear leans on it. Musicians shared screenshots. A bassist said it sounded like the union that never showed up. A singer said she wanted to believe in fairness, but not like this. A drummer pointed out the drop points and said someone was building a map of control, never mind profit. They argued in threads, then agreed in person to keep cash close and leave together. Police drafted a statement that said nothing about the letter. They called it noise, off the record, while assigning uniforms to the listed drop spots. They stationed unmarked cars with clear sightlines and told officers to act like shadows on a wall, present, quiet, and ready. The chief reminded the room that whoever wrote this had already shown he counted weekends and watched rooms. He would also watch doors with cops. Night came with fewer people in seats and more at the bar. Faces turned to the mirrors. Managers handed out envelopes early. Bands tallied fast, then played the last set anyway, because music pays rent and fear does not. A trumpet traced a line that hit the back wall and curved back into the room, warm, small, stubborn. Outside, an officer shifted in an unmarked sedan and read the header again on his phone. Jazz in every home. He thought about his daughter practicing scales. He thought about how rules arrive and who gets to write them. By Monday, the phones at the precinct were a metronome. Owners called to say they had paid. Musicians called to say they had been paid. Nobody called to say they felt safe. The letter had shifted the room from fear to obedience, then to something harder to manage, suspicion. Every envelope handed across a bar came with eyes on the ceiling, waiting for a sound that would rewrite the night. The first hard escalation hit at dusk, when a club on Lyle prepped for a jam. The kitchen door swung, and a line cook yelled that the alley smelled like gasoline. 2 beat cops were already half a block away. They rounded the corner to find a small plastic jug wedged under the door with a rag stuffed through the mouth. The match never touched. The message did. Fire would now sit in the same pocket as bullets. A forensics tech lifted a faint partial print off the handle, then groaned when the swirls ran into the ridged texture of cheap plastic. It charted to no one, then to everyone with rough hands. While that was happening, a pianist on East Avenue walked out to catch air and saw a man watching the front. Not lurking, just standing in the slow wash of neon like he was checking a set list posted on glass. The pianist said, "Hello." The man nodded, smiled, then asked if the owner kept the cash in the office or the kitchen safe. The pianist lied, said the bank picked up after the first set. The man smiled again and walked. The pianist wrote down the time and the color of the man's jacket, a green that looked grey under the lights. He handed it to a patrol who wrote it again, then stuck it under a magnet on the squad car dash like a reminder to breathe. The second escalation landed 20 minutes later on Joseph. A locked side door gave, hinges popped quick, and the room went dark as if a breaker had tripped. The band stopped mid-phrase. A flashlight bobbed near the board. The owner stepped toward it and found himself staring into a lens of pepper spray. He hit the floor, coughing hard. In the confusion, a hand swept 2 envelopes from the bar, the night's first split and the house cut, still uncounted. When lights came back, the door swung gently, and the scent of citrus sat over everything, sharp and wrong. It felt less like robbery and more like a warning about who controlled the dark. The chief greenlit staggered walkthroughs. Officers in pairs drifted into rooms and stayed just long enough to be seen. It steadied some, rattled others. One singer said into the mic that police made her feel safer. Half the crowd clapped. The other half shifted on stools like their names had been called. Owners changed small habits. Cash boxes moved from drawers to apron pockets. A bartender wore a money belt under her dress and swore she would never tell her mother. Meanwhile, the drop points turned active. The pawnshop owner, who usually kept his eyes on jewelry, counted 3 envelopes with care a banker would envy. He said he hated every second. He stamped receipts with a date and a tiny star because he liked order in disorder. A uniform sat across the street, pretending to eat a hot dog that had cooled to rubber. He watched hands pass paper and tried to memorize gaits and shoulders, the things masks and caps can't change. He logged 12 men, 5 women, 2 kids, sent as runners with nervous grins. None fit the composite from the hallway, which changed again in memory. A rumor grew teeth by midnight. Someone said the next weekend would be the real purge. The phrase traveled fast and arrived warped. Purge becoming tax, tax becoming strike, strike becoming blackout. The word blackout stuck when a breaker blew at a club in Brighton and stayed down for 6 minutes. Candles came out, phones flashed, and a drummer kept time on a rim while the audience hummed a melody that felt like a rally more than a song. The owner swore it was old wiring. A tech swore the panel had been thrown. The detective on scene wrote both versions and underlined neither. Then came the onslaught's cleanest shot. Not lethal, but mean. A single round hit a steel exit bar in a hallway where kids stacked chairs after matinees. The ricochet bit a wall and died. The sound rang long. A busboy vomited from adrenaline. The round deformed enough to hide its story. No clean lands and grooves for the lab to match. Whoever fired it wanted noise, not murder, at least not here, not now. It trained the city to expect violence, while withholding it, a cruel efficiency. By sunrise, the panic had matured. Parents texted check-ins to adult children who bartended. Musicians made chains of rides. Nobody walking alone. Grocery back rooms took on the quiet of counting rooms in old movies, except this was not nostalgia, it was survival, translated into arithmetic. The chief faced cameras again and called for calm without promising it. He reminded owners that paying under threat does not end threats, it feeds them. He also knew nobody wanted a lecture from a podium while they bled cash and fear. In apartments above small clubs, people heard the city rethink itself. The letter set rules, the knights enforced them, and the streets obeyed because disobedience had a sound everyone now recognized. A trumpet practiced long tones in a room with curtains drawn. A cook set his knives in a roll and placed it by the door. A bouncer tested the weight of a new flashlight in his hand and thought about how light fails, then returns. By Tuesday, detectives were trading sleep for names. The first man to rise came from a bartender's quiet certainty. She said he tipped in exact change, watched doorways the way staff watch tabs, and showed up only when the room got loud. He worked at a warehouse near the river, drove a grey sedan with a mismatched mirror, and wore a green jacket that looked grey under lights. A tale learned he lifted weights after midnight and ate at a diner that never closes. A warrant turned his trunk into a photograph of ordinary life. Jumper cables, a moving blanket, a half-used bottle of motor oil. The lab found fibres that looked close to the upholstery thread from the mirror room, then called them common and set them aside. A second face surfaced because he talked too much. A self-styled promoter with business cards printed crooked, he boasted that he was bringing order to a chaotic scene. He had opinions about splits, lectured musicians about sustainability, and called owners by their first names like a dare. He matched the tone of the letter, but not the competence. When detectives pressed him on Saturday at midnight, he said he was home live streaming a vinyl cleaning tutorial. The stream existed, the comments were real, his alibi held, thin and annoying. Then there was the man everyone called Cousin, the messenger who told a trumpet player to clear out. He swore he only passed warnings, the city's nervous system in human form. He knew doors, kitchens, and doormen by nickname. He knew who carried cash and who stayed open late. That knowledge made him feel like a puppet master in miniature. He also had a record, small things, a fight, a shoplift. Under the light, he talked a fast circle. He was afraid of whoever wrote the letter. He wanted the credit without the heat. He played runner because he didn't like funerals. Across town, a quiet janitor came into focus. He had keys to 3 venues, moved like he had nothing to prove, and always parked facing out. On Saturday, he clocked a double shift, fixing a leak and wrangling a stubborn breaker that tripped twice. He had access, timing, and a calm that worried people. But when the lab swabbed his hands, they got bleach, oil from a hinge, and the powder from latex gloves. The breaker panel showed wear that had nothing to do with sabotage. He had been doing his job while the city guessed wrong. Anonymous tips flooded in with a new theme: the flat cap, the beanie, the jacket that shifts color under neon. People handed over photos from their phones, men standing in doorways, backs half-turned, faces blurred. Detectives pinned them to a board and watched it become a crowd of almosts. A composite artist tried again, this time using 2 witnesses from the hallway shot. One remembered a scar near the ear, the other swore the man had a clean jawline and no marks. Memory bent under fear, and the sketch turned into a generic face that looked like a fifth of the district. A rumor pointed at a pawn shop owner because the letter listed his counter as a compliance support point. He bristled, showed tax returns, and let detectives comb through his basement, which held nothing but empty guitar cases and a broken snare. He said being useful was not the same as being involved. The officers nodded. They had learned that lesson already. The sharpest dead end came from a man who fit too well. He coached a community jazz workshop, knew load-in schedules, and drove a van with blacked-out rear windows. He lived near 2 of the clubs and often wore a green jacket. He also had receipts from Saturday at midnight, gas, groceries, a mechanic's invoice time-stamped 11:58. Cameras caught him paying. The timeline refused to break. The chief wrote, "Too neat," in his notebook, then closed it. By Wednesday, stories started to move faster than facts. Bartenders told new hires that the shooter always stands near the service exit, even when Saturday proved otherwise. A trumpet player swore the letter writer tapped his glass during a ballad, 3 times, same rhythm as the club's old ice machine. A cook said he saw a green jacket in the freezer reflection. People believed pieces because belief is lighter than proof, and lighter things travel farther. Neighborhood kids turned the ultimatum into a chant. 10 for the band, 10 for the band. They drummed on milk crates outside a bodega and called it practice. Their parents told them to stop. They kept the rhythm and lost the words, then kept the rhythm anyway. Rules were becoming beats. Beats were becoming rules. That is how scenes reshape themselves when they are scared and stubborn at the same time. Clubs adjusted in ways that looked like tradition the moment they stuck. Bands started splitting the first set before the second. Envelopes on music stands like set lists. A new custom took root. Last tune called early, if a back door rattled twice. The drummer's eyes going to the bassist nodding toward the exit. The sound tech sliding the lights up as if it were part of the show. People called it the lift. It belonged to the city by Thursday, as if it had been there forever. Meanwhile, the phrase from the letter got unhooked from threat and tied to something else. Jazz in every home appeared on handmade flyers for a Sunday afternoon porch jam, 2 blocks from any venue. Families dragged out folding chairs. A kid played scales while his aunt clapped the offbeats. A neighbor who used to sing in church found her harmony again. They did not invite the ultimatum into that space. They took the phrase and bent it back to where it might have started. A hope, not a weapon. Folklore needs a face, so the district made one. The man in the green jacket, the one who hums, became a composite of habits and shadows. Someone said he used to be a record store clerk who hated reissues. Someone else said he was a union rep disappointed by people who pocketed dues. A third insisted he was 2 people, one who writes and one who walks. The truth stayed small and mean. Nobody had him. Stories did, because stories never miss a shift. Owners who survived the week added rituals that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with breathing. Staff ate together before doors, not after. A host lit a single votive near the board. Superstition turned into calm. A saxophonist put her rings back on and decided she would play the ballad every night now, not to tempt fate, but to make the room answer to something other than fear. The first time she did it, the room stayed quiet all the way through, then exhaled like they had been holding a shared note. Police adjusted their posture. Instead of walking through and leaving, they sat down for one tune, paid their tab, and left a tip. It took the edge off the mirror feeling. It also turned them into part of the room that rumor could not fully weaponize. The chief understood what was happening. The city was writing its own counter-letter, not on paper, but in routines that said, "We're still here, we will be here tomorrow, and your rules do not get the last chorus." Years from now, people would argue about when the danger ended. Some said it burned out the moment envelopes felt normal. Others said it ended when a drummer missed the downbeat, laughed, and the crowd laughed with him. Memory compresses weeks into a single night that never existed. What stayed true was simpler. The scene learned how to dance around a threat without letting the threat lead. The letter tried to score the room. The room gave itself a different chart. The phrase survived. It turned into a yearly block party with borrowed amps and kids with second-hand horns. The pawn shop owner grilled hot dogs and told anyone who would listen that compliance support had been an awful joke the city outlived. The grocer's nephew ran sound from a card table. Someone taped the first letter's header to a lamppost and wrote a new line under it in black marker, the kind that bleeds through. Jazz in every home, joy in every bar. People clapped, off the beat and on, and no one cared which. Let's get to the final story. The body broke the surface at dawn. A phone in his pocket buzzed until the battery died. 20 feet away, on a moss-dark wall under the bridge, someone had sprayed a simple smiley face. 2 dots. A crooked grin. His parents waited upstream, clutching coffee that went cold long before the diver waved. Police called it another tragic fall. Locals shrugged. Winter takes what it wants. But that yellow grin kept showing up near cold water and missing nights, college towns, bar districts, holiday weekends. Independent investigators started mapping pins. Accident, coincidence, or a coordinated hunting ground hiding behind a child's doodle. To understand why anyone would chase a spray-painted grin across the Midwest, we need to go back to the late 1990s. A run of disappearances began to feel familiar in cities that didn't talk to each other. Young men went out drinking with friends. Someone lost track of time. A bouncer waved them off the sidewalk. A group text went unanswered. Snow piled high. Weeks later, a fisherman or a spring thaw found them in the water. Detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte were already living with one of those cases in New York when they started hearing about others. They pulled public reports, newspaper clippings, and the kind of neighborhood stories that only surface over coffee with patrol officers. On a wall-sized map, they stuck pins where bodies were recovered and traced thin threads back to the last places they were seen. The lines crossed bar districts, river walks, and campuses that looked eerily alike in winter. What stood out wasn't just the age, usually college-aged men, often athletic, often studying engineering or business. It was the rhythm, last seen after midnight, bitter temperatures, security cameras that faced doors but not sidewalks leading to the water. The exits were always clean. A friend turned around to close a tab. A cab didn't show. A campus shuttle just left. By morning, the trail was already cold. Without an obvious crime scene, the default explanation was intoxication and exposure. Meanwhile, something else was happening at the edges of those recoveries. Near underpasses, on abutments, below railings along canals, investigators began photographing simple faces sprayed on concrete. Not one style, sometimes cartoonish, sometimes minimal, sometimes nearly washed away, but similar enough to make a tired detective pause on a freezing search. A smiley face. For Gannon and Duarte, that symbol became a thread to pull. They noted proximity, dates, and distances. Was the graffiti there before the disappearance? Did it show up after a body was found? Did anyone else in the neighborhood tag those walls? Critics didn't hesitate. Smiley faces are everywhere. It's one of the most common tags on the planet. If you look for it, you'll find it. Law enforcement in several cities listed the cause as accidental drowning tied to alcohol. The threshold to reopen cases without new forensic evidence is high. Blood toxicology, when available, often supported drinking. With cold water and time, bodies told incomplete stories. The burden fell back on grieving families who heard more than once, "We've seen this before." Stakes rose with each closed case. When a case is labelled accidental, homicide resources rarely get deployed. No canvas of every camera on the route. No phones pulled from towers, unless there's probable cause. No dive team sweeping the exact entry point because nobody can say where that was. Parents hired private investigators. Flyers went up anyway. Students walked in pairs for a week. Then finals arrived, and the river kept moving. Here's where it gets tricky. Pattern recognition is both a survival tool and a trap. Gannon and Duarte saw repeated elements that would catch any trained eye. Similar routes, similar gaps, similar recoveries. But what nobody knew at the time was whether the smiley faces were signatures or static. Tag culture thrives on repetition. A single symbol can belong to 1,000 hands. The detectives tried to filter noise from signal with timestamps, interviews, and site photos. They catalogued murals that predated incidents and noted fresh paint without context. 3 days after one recovery in a Midwestern city, a new face appeared beneath a bridge on the most direct walking path from the last seen bar. The distance was under 300 yards. Locals said kids tagged there every weekend. A business owner swore he'd never seen that face before. The detectives added it to their list but marked it unverified. That careful hedging kept their theory alive in rooms where skepticism was the default. This was the moment everything changed for their map. A winter clustered with cases across state lines. Pins formed arcs along rivers, feeding the Great Lakes and the Mississippi. The pattern wasn't proof, but it was pressure. Either one case would stand up to homicide standards and shift the narrative, or the entire theory would fold under the weight of coincidence. As families pushed for answers, one name started to circulate as a possible test. Minneapolis had a case that wouldn't stay quiet. Halloween in Minneapolis has a way of softening hard edges. Costumes, crowded sidewalks, a quick wind off the river. Chris Jenkins left a downtown bar in a Native American-style costume with fringe, moccasin-style footwear, and a red t-shirt after a night out with friends. He was 21, a business major, and a goalie on the University of Minnesota lacrosse team. At some point before midnight, there was a disagreement at the bar. Security escorted him outside. He didn't have his coat. Temperatures were dropping. He didn't come home. His girlfriend started calling. Friends retraced steps. A missing persons report followed, but with an adult and alcohol in the story, urgency sagged. Search flyers went up anyway. Volunteers walked the river's edge with flashlights, calling his name into the dark. Police checked shelters and hospitals. Weeks turned into months. In spring, after the thaw, a body surfaced near the Mississippi's west bank. It was Chris. The initial ruling matched the pattern everyone had learned to expect. Accidental drowning, intoxication, a contributing factor. With no obvious trauma noted in early reporting and a winter in cold water, the assumption felt practical, but the family didn't accept it. They hired private investigators, kept pushing for a deeper review, and kept pointing to details that didn't sit right. Those details were simple, but they echoed in conversations. The clothing. Chris was found still wearing his costume, which suggested he never made it home to change or warm up. His wallet and keys were still with him. One report noted that his hands were crossed on his chest when recovered, which didn't match how bodies typically position after long periods in moving water. Family advocates said that could indicate staging or restraint. Others argued currents can shift limbs in strange ways. Even among experts, cold water recoveries are hard to read. To understand why the case flipped, it helps to slow down on the evidence threshold. Minneapolis Homicide reviewed more interviews, bar security accounts, and the timeline leaving the door. There were questions about the route he would have taken if he was walking home without a coat in below freezing weather. Could he have navigated the riverbanks in moccasin-style footwear on icy ground? A witness came forward with information about a confrontation outside. Combined with inconsistencies in earlier statements, the picture changed. In 2006, nearly 4 years after he vanished, police reclassified Chris Jenkins' death as a homicide. That reversal landed like a jolt. It wasn't proof of a network or a symbol. It was proof that one case in the cluster could meet homicide standards after being written off as accidental. For families across the Midwest, it was a crack in the wall. And the graffiti? Investigators checked the immediate landscape. Along the Mississippi's banks in Minneapolis, tags come and go in waves. Underpasses and bridge piers carry layers of paint. There were reports of simple faces within walking distance of the bar district and near common footpaths to the river. But tying any single face to Chris's disappearance proved impossible. Photographs from before and after the recovery showed multiple tags, weathered at different rates. Some faces predated that Halloween. Others appeared after news coverage spread. The link was suggestive, not definitive. So what does one reclassification mean in a sea of drownings? It validates the fear that at least some recoveries conceal crimes. It also complicates the theory. One confirmed homicide doesn't convert every case into murder, but it changes posture. It tells detectives what families had argued for years. Don't assume the river did the work. As Minneapolis shifted its view, other cities felt the pressure. Winter would come again. The same routes, the same gaps, the same water. And the argument over pattern or coincidence would only get louder. While Minneapolis argued over cause and manner, the symbol kept creeping back into conversations. A simple face near cold water. Investigators who believed in the pattern treated each one like a potential breadcrumb. They built spreadsheets with GPS coordinates, distances from last seen locations, and dates of both disappearance and recovery. Then they set rules. A face within 250 to 500 yards of a probable entry point counted as proximate. Anything beyond that was noise, unless a path naturally funneled foot traffic past it. They tried to anchor each tag in time with old photos, street view captures, or local shop surveillance aimed at parking lots. Here's where the ground got shaky. Style variance was huge. Some faces were playful, bubble letter loops. Others were quick, angular dots and a line. Tag culture thrives on repetition and imitation. Someone sees a simple mark in one spot and replicates it 2 blocks over. There's no forensic database for graffiti the way there is for ballistics. Paint brands overlap, nozzle types blur stroke differences, and street weathering erases edges. Unless an artist claims a piece, or gets caught with a can in hand, attribution is guesswork. Even then, a single writer can't speak to a city's worth of marks. They also discovered a timing trap. In several cities, archived photos from neighborhood blogs showed faces on flood walls months before a disappearance. In others, new faces showed up days after news broke, a kind of morbid echo. A tag drawn after a recovery doesn't mean anything unless you believe someone is taunting. That's a leap that law enforcement won't make without more. Contamination is constant. Kids tag, rival crews cross each other out, utility workers paint over, and the cycle repeats. When a symbol is simple, it's nearly impossible to prove authorship in court. So the detectives narrowed their lens. They prioritized sites where a face sat in a hard-to-reach spot, down a steep embankment, on the riverside of a safety barrier, or tucked under a bridge pier that required a boat or nerve to access. The logic was straightforward. A tagger looking for visibility usually hits walls facing foot traffic. A face hidden near water felt deliberate. They also logged instances where faces paired with odd secondary marks, letters, arrows, or specific numbers, especially when those extras showed up in more than one city. Critics pushed back with math. The base rate fallacy loomed over every pin on the map. In urban areas, especially near water and rail, graffiti density is high. If you walk a half-mile of riverfront in most college towns, you'll find faces, initials, and symbols. If the symbol is common, proximity can be coincidence. Confirmation bias does the rest. Once a detective expects to find a face, every circle and dot reads as a match. To counter that, the investigators tried blind tests, sending photos to analysts without context and asking them to categorize symbols. The results were mixed. A few cases did nudge the conversation. In one city, a face with a distinctive looped grin sat exactly at the point where a low fence was bent outward, as if someone had pushed through. That same looped grin appeared months earlier on a canal wall 2 states away, next to a set of initials that matched. Nobody could prove the same hand made them, but the specificity stood out. In another case, a face included a date string that matched the night a student vanished. Local taggers told police that wasn't typical. They avoid dates because they age the art. Those were rare, and still not enough to carry a prosecution. Meanwhile, families took photos of every chalked smile near a memorial, and some of those images surfaced online without location data, muddying timelines further. Chain of custody for imagery became a problem. A photo taken after a vigil could be posted next to an article about the initial search, compressing time in a way that suggests a clue where none exists. Investigators who believed in the pattern started using time-stamped body cams on river sweeps to lock down what was present during searches. What nobody knew at the time was whether the symbol mattered at all, or if it just made grief tangible. A face is something to point at. It's a villain you can draw. Yet the behavioral pattern, men, nights out, water, winter, kept resurfacing, even when no face was found within a mile. That forced a split. For some, the graffiti became a narrative device, a signpost in a scary story. For others, it stayed a working lead, filtered through distance rules and timing. The question lingered: was the face a signature, a coincidence, or a mirror we held up to fear?